Today we're going to talk about Ireland and England, predominantly England, not because Ireland isn't important, but because we know less about Ireland. The reason we know relatively more about England in its post-Roman period, that is to say after 420, is because of the historian Bede writing in the early 8th century. A monk at Jarrow, which was a part of a twin monastery in Northumbria. You see on your map the northeastern part of England before you get to what's now Scotland. Bede wrote, among other things, a history of the English church and people, which is full of miracles and very, very, pro-Christian as much as Gregory of Tours, but is a much more easy-to-follow narrative, and a narrative with a certain kind of point. It's about the conversion of England and the establishment of the church. The other advantage for England over Ireland in terms of evidence is archaeology. A lot more has been done with excavating sites in England. Now, by England, we mean literally England, the part that is not Wales, not Scotland, not Ireland, the part of the British Isles. The ensemble, essentially the two islands, are referred to as the British Isles. Britain is England, Scotland, and Wales. Ireland is Ireland. The Britons, however, B-R-I-T-O-N-S, are the collective term for the Celtic population. Celtic is both a linguistic group and a somewhat vague ethnic term. It means the people who were there in the British Isles before the Romans came, and who were there afterwards fighting invaders from Europe. These invaders, who come in the 440s, known as the Anglo-Saxons. Bede tells us it's the Angles, the Saxons, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The Angles give their name to England, Angleland. The Jutes we know nothing about. So, a certain kind of medievalist will go on about founding a journal of Jute studies and inviting contributors to something that we really have absolutely no idea of. It would be, in that league of smallest, thinnest volumes, at least in terms of three-dimensional books. The Saxons come from, there is still a very large part of Germany called Saxony. What the nature of these peoples are, how they were differentiated among themselves, is a source of a lot of real, or at least looks real, scholarship as opposed to studying the Jutes, but we don't have to go into that. But you need to get the cast of characters. Celts, Anglo-Saxons, and the Anglo-Saxons conquer much of the island, more or less what would become England, but not all. They do not conquer Scotland, they do not conquer Wales, and they don't really conquer Cornwall. So the western part of Britain remains Celtic. And to this day, Wales and Scotland consider themselves different from England. You can get into a lot of trouble by calling that area England with the people there, and particularly in Scotland, there's a possibility that they may separate from the United Kingdom at some point. Ireland. Ireland was never occupied by the Romans. Ireland was Celtic, was in contact with the Roman Empire, but was not part of it. This makes some difference, and we'll talk about it when we come to talk about conversion. But it doesn't make as much difference as it sounds, because the thing about England, or Britain, is that the Roman impress there would be almost wiped out once the Romans withdrew. And so, in contrast to what we saw with Gregory of Tours and Merovingian Gaul, Frankish kingdom, the Roman influence in Britain is almost wiped out. Recall what we saw as persistence of Roman practices in the Merovingian kingdom. Bishops, cities, the Latin language, tax records, written legal codes. That is not to say that the Merovingians weren't, as I said before, to be described by technical terms like thugs, or that this was a sleek, well-functioning kingdom. You know, you landed at the airport and got the train immediately, and everything was sleek and nice, like Amsterdam or someplace like that, as opposed to Kennedy. But that the Roman inheritance was visible and influential. In Britain, when the Roman troops withdrew to fight the invaders in Gaul, this ended Roman society in Britain. And the reason for this is partly that Britain was a frontier, viewed from the point of view of the Mediterranean, the center of gravity of the Roman Empire. The frontier symbolized most dramatically by walls, the most famous of which is Hadrian's Wall, a wall that separated out the barbarians, but since you didn't have a river like the Danube or the Rhine, there seemed to be no natural frontier. Remnants of Hadrian's Wall are the largest souvenir of the Roman era. A wall to keep out the barbarians from the north, because in fact the Romans didn't conquer the entire island. They conquered the parts they thought were worthwhile. And they did think it was worthwhile, frontier or not. We know that the Romans built villas. Might be a little cold, these somewhat open-air Mediterranean plan things, but mosaic courtyards, drank a lot of wine, much of it imported, built cities, walls, other fortifications, cultivated land. So it's not as if there wasn't a serious Roman province of Britain from its conquest in the late 1st century until its abandonment in the early 5th century. But here, the invaders tended to obliterate much of what had been there in Roman times. And the Celtic population, who had been Romanized, at least at the elite levels, the Celtic population didn't really save very much from the Roman Empire. The Celts might remain Christian, whereas the invaders were pagan. But the Celts tended not to have cities, or at least large centers, and they tended not to have or retain Roman forms of government. The one kind of, if not literally interesting, at least weird aspect of Celtic Roman resistance is the figure of King Arthur. I'm going to bring him up now, and then I'm going to drop him. King Arthur belongs properly to the continuation of this course because his legendary status starts in the world of romance, of French romance, and then of international romance, chivalric literature. By romance, we mean not only love stories, but novels of chivalry, of knights, of battles. He is a figure who is 99.9% legend, whatever the remainder of that 0.1% real. Insofar as he's real, he may be identified with Celtic resistance to the Anglo-Saxon invaders, Celtic Roman resistance in the late 5th, early 6th centuries. But the proportion of art to history in this is, if not 99.9, at least very, very substantial. So the original setting of the Arthurian stories is that of the resistance to the Anglo-Saxon invaders. The Arthurian romances do have a kind of Celtic beginning. Well, not a kind of. They have a Celtic beginning, and then they are appropriated by people in the Romance language tradition, French, first of all. So, as Wickham says on page 151, nowhere else in the Roman Empire was the collapse of culture, economy, and urbanization so complete. He uses that wonderful phrase again, radical economic simplification, i.e., there's no more plumbing, there's no more sort of what we would consider to be affluent, civilized society. The ceramics don't come from Africa anymore. The wine doesn't come from France anymore. People are reduced to a kind of subsistence, or at least most people, because as we'll see, some of these kings actually are able to get some luxury goods from abroad. If it were just a story of barbarization, it would be less interesting than, in fact, the peculiar nature of England in this period, which goes from being a contested territory between the Germanic invaders and the Celtic population to a kingdom slowly converted in the course of the 7th century to Christianity from paganism to the leading center of culture in Europe. Bede, who lived from 673 to 735, was the most cultivated scholar in Europe of the early 8th century. And the most cultivated scholar in Europe of the late 8th century was also from England, Alcuin, counselor and advisor to Charlemagne. How do you go from being a, well, I don't like to use the word primitive, but certainly barbarian enough area to having the largest libraries, the most cultivated scholars? Now, it is true, as I think I've said before, that any time you can say that such and such a person was the smartest person in Europe has got to be a fairly bad time. Right? In the 19th century, you have your choice from all sorts of scientific, literary, other kinds of intellectual experts. Who would even dare to say? But we know that Boethius and Cassiodorus are the smartest guys in Europe in the 6th century because they have access to stuff that almost no one else does, because they're writing about classical authors that almost no one else has in their libraries. We know that Isidore of Seville is probably the smartest guy of the early 7th century in Visigothic Spain, because we have his works, we have an idea of what he's read, we know his sources, and again, he's got the biggest library. Biggest library may mean 100 books. But 100 books in 700 AD is a serious collection of knowledge. Now, this is not easy knowledge. This is not, as if everything were, well, I don't want to say Wikipedia either. Everything were kind of like Wikipedia 5 years ago, elementary and often wrong. These are very different kinds of works from what might interest us. Certainly a lot of biblical stuff, but also, for example, a lot of computing of time. Bede would be remembered for the history of the English church and people, but also for a lot of his works on figuring out time. He is credited, although not uniquely credited, but is an important person in the development of the BC AD scheme. Believe it or not, people are not born into the world calculating according to BC AD. Lots of people calculate according to other systems. How do they come up with this? And moreover, how do they then fit the calendar into it? How do you keep time when you don't have electric or battery-operated clocks? How do you know what the seasonal changes are? But in fact, the most troublesome problem, which had been particularly controversial to the conversion of England in the generation before Bede, in the early 7th and mid-7th century was the calculation of Easter. Easter is a real problem. Now, naturally, it's not a problem if someone else tells you. If, in 1970 you open up a little pocket book calendar and, it says, okay, Easter is this day, you trust them. Or now, if you have some feature on your iPhone that gives you Easter for the next 3,000 years in case you want to know when Easter is in, 3500 AD, no problem. But if you're out there in Northumbria, or anywhere for that matter, in a monastery somewhere, where it's really crucial to celebrate it on the right day. Remember what I said about dogma and religious observation? God doesn't want you to say something like, dude, I don't really know when Easter is, but I think I'm going to celebrate it now. You can't do that. You can't just decide, I know it's sort of in the spring, nobody around here for miles and miles and miles knows how to calculate it, so what the heck? We'll do it on a Tuesday because I'm busy on what I think is Easter. That's not the way monasticism works, and we'll talk about that next week. The schedule is really, really important, but it's also difficult to figure out, and people disagree about it. To this day, the Eastern Orthodox churches celebrate a different date for Easter than the Western because they operate according to a different calendar. All right, well, so I'm not saying that this is the kind of knowledge that you ought to drop everything else to pursue, but it is a kind of knowledge that requires a sort of observation that, in fact, we do not have. Most of us, unless we're astronomy majors, have no idea what the sky looks like at night. A, because we can't see it because of artificial light, and B, because we're not very curious. We cannot track animals, most of us. And those of you who can, I'm interested in your knowledge. Most of us haven't the faintest idea how things grow, except because we've been to the Yale farm and, oh my gosh, look at this stuff. That's part of the reason for it, because we're not very close to nature. I think that environmental concerns notwithstanding, most of us have a huge investment in not being too close to nature. But the observation of phenomena is something that is much superior in so-called indigenous, primitive, traditional, or historical societies. So the story of England and Ireland centers on conversion, and the reason this is so is because conversion represents a change in orientation towards a larger world. Instead of a kind of tribal and fragmented identity, I'm not making a statement about the truth or non-truth of Christianity, but about the sense of belonging to a larger world whose purposes encompass not only your group, but a larger group of people out there. And I think we can get a feeling for this from a famous passage of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, written in 731. And he is describing events of about a century earlier, when King Edwin of Northumbria summoned a council to decide whether or not to accept the Christian God. And the chief of the pagan priests speaks in favor of embracing Christianity, even though you would think that he would be the defender of the old faith. He, in fact, speaks to this assembly, according to Bede, in favor of Christianity on the grounds that it tells us what went before us and what will come after us. And the passage goes like this: "And one of the king's chief men presently said, 'Thus seems it to me, O king, the present life of man on earth, against that time which is unknown to us, is as if you were sitting at a feast with your chief men and your thanes, your nobles, in wintertime,' Thanes. The fire burns and the hall is warm, and outside it rains and snows and storms. There comes a sparrow and swiftly flies through the house. The insulation's not great in these halls, right? It comes through one door and it goes out another. Lo, in the time in which he is within, he is not touched by the winter storm. But that time is the flash of an eye and the least of times. And he soon passes from winter out to winter again. So is the life of man, revealed for a brief space. But what went before and what follows after, we do not know. Therefore, if this teaching can reveal any more certain knowledge, it seems only right we should follow it. Now, this is not why people necessarily converted, because not everybody's really bothered by that. Most people figure, wow, I'm in the hall, it's warm, it's great, I'm having such a good time, and when I have to leave, brief though it will be, I'll deal with that. But it does explain some of the appeal of Christianity and why the invaders who were, quote, pagan, converted. And indeed why people tend to convert to world religions like Christianity and Islam to this day. A local religion, which I'm calling tribal only because by that I mean confined to a people whose identity is caught up in their religion. A tribal people or a tribal religion has trouble surviving extensive contact with other people because its uniqueness is threatened by the realization that there's a huge world out there of lots of other people, and when you start interacting with them, that is, when you're no longer isolated, you will tend to seek an explanation for things that is grander than just, these gods protect my spear, this god protects my hearth, this god protects against accidents in childbirth. There are exceptions. Judaism is one of the most obvious. Here is a religion of a small group of people that survives over the centuries. But it is not exactly a tribal religion in the sense that it's monotheistic, and historical sense is very strong. And this is what the priest means, or at least this is what I mean in interpreting the priest's words as reported by Bede, by historical sense, a sense that God rules over the world even if I'm not in it, that there is something to come, not necessarily that there is an afterlife, although that obviously is part of the teachings of Christianity, but that there is a kind of purpose to life. So, conversion. The conversions of Ireland and England are different. The process of converting England begins in 597 with a missionary known, unfortunately his name is Augustine. This is Augustine of Canterbury, not Augustine of Hippo, the Confessions Augustine. He is sent by the Roman Pope, Gregory the First, Gregory the Great. Bede tells us that he was motivated to do this. It's a very strange thing to do. There had not been missionaries sent by the Pope before. That he was motivated to do this by seeing British boys for sale in the slave market in Rome and asking who they were. He was told they were Angles, Anglos as in Anglo-Saxon, A-N-G-L-E-S. And he is reputed to have said, we should make them angels, not angles. Angeli, known Angli, or angels, not angles. Whatever the story, Augustine arrived around 597 at an island that had some remnants of Celtic Christianity, but is basically pagan and barbarian. He landed in Kent, in the southeast corner of the island, closest to the continent. And on this map, what I'd like you to know particularly are Kent, with Canterbury as its capital, in the southeast, Wessex in the west, which I think I've helpfully underlined, Mercia towards the center, Northumbria, northeast. The most important kingdoms in England, and Wickham has emphasized how fragmented this territory was, the most important kingdoms would be at different times Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. But the first place to convert is Kent. It faces the continent. The pagan ruler of Kent had actually married a Christian princess from Merovingian Gaul. And Augustine established the first bishopric in Kent at Canterbury, which would be henceforth the major ecclesiastical center of Britain, its archbishopric. Bede tells us about this, but he also tells us a lot more about Northumbria, which is where he lived. And here you can see the off-again, on-again pace of conversion. The pious King Edwin, who had that council that we just described, converted his people after a vision. But after his death in 633, his successor went back to the old traditional religion, renouncing Christianity. And then the successor to that king, a man named Oswald, reestablished Christianity. But he was killed in battle by the pagan king of Mercia in 642. Only in the 660s, 670s is England pretty definitively converted to Christianity. We can see this kind of transition in two of the most famous sources of information about this world. The poem Beowulf. How many people have read this? Yeah, everybody's read this at one time or another. Beowulf does have some little Christian themes, and there is some debate as to what extent the poem is to be understood in Christian terms. But in its atmosphere, its rituals, the burial in the ship, the burning of the body, the devotion not only to war but to feasting and to gold, ring giving, it evokes, not merely evokes, it is a description of a warrior society in which, although it is written in Old English, remember that it actually takes place in Denmark. This is a North Sea world in which the communications patterns are such that you could write an English poem about someone who goes over to the mainland for adventure. The other source is one of the great archaeological triumphs of the last 100 years, the so-called Sutton Hoo treasure, which is in the British Museum. In East Anglia, close to the water, actually, close to the sea, a burial ship was found in 1939. Probably the king buried here was Redwald, king of East Anglia. Who died in 627. Now, it's a pagan burial because of all the grave goods. You know, all this stuff is in there, or so it would seem. But it's hard to tell, just as in Beowulf, is it pagan, is it Christian? It's hard to tell about this burial scene because he's got a lot of stuff from what might be called foreign gifts or maybe plunder. Foreign gifts, he's got 2 Byzantine silver spoons. So 2 silver spoons made in Constantinople or thereabouts. He's got gold coins. They're mostly from the Merovingian kingdom, and they're different. They're all different. This is not an economic thing. This is a treasure thing, right? The difference between economy and treasure is that treasure is just for hoarding, and economy is fluid and transactional. The hoarding, of course, we see in Beowulf most obviously with the dragon. The dragon is not accumulating the treasure in order to safeguard his retirement, you know, or trade up in caves. He just sleeps on this treasure. And the point of that is, of course, that people accumulate treasure for non-economic reasons, for reasons that have to do with their own satisfaction or their own anxieties. And the utility of treasure is generally overestimated. Nevertheless, of course, at the same time, this is a world in which gold, treasure accumulation is what men do. So what else is at Sutton Hoo? A wonderful helmet, unique in, because these things tend to disintegrate, a sword, a mail shirt, and then all sorts of little paraphernalia, some of it with Christian symbols like crosses, some of it very much in the pagan kind of world. Beowulf and Sutton Hoo go together. They both show us a world of treasure, of weapons, of drinking halls, of palaces, sort of isolated. The drinking hall is important, as you know from Beowulf. It is the manifestation of civilization. It is that protection from outside that Bede describes in the little sparrow anecdote. But it is also the center of government. We're back to the ruler and his entourage, or comitatus, his gang, if you want to put a more cynical coloration on it. So the conversion of England is completed by the late 7th century, but it is a more complicated story than just monolithic Christianity versus monolithic paganism, because there are two kinds of Christianity that seek to convert England, one from Ireland and one from Rome. Ireland, let's just pause over Ireland. Never part of the Roman Empire, as I said, but it's also the first place outside the Roman world to have been converted to Christianity. The first place in Europe, actually. The first place, period, is Ethiopia. Ethiopia, of course, in northeastern Africa, would be converted to Christianity very early, 4th century AD, probably. But within Europe, Ireland was converted to Christianity by the British or English missionary St. Patrick. This is a little embarrassing, but in fact, the apostle to Ireland is one of those British, Celtic, Roman, 4th century figures, Patrick. So in 600 AD, Ireland was largely Catholic, while England was mostly pagan. Irish Christianity had certain peculiarities, some of them related to its lack of a Roman past. Thus, for example, it did not have bishops, really, or the bishops were weak, because there had not been cities in Ireland on the Roman model, and therefore Christianity didn't have an urban background, but rather a very decentralized and rural background. The most powerful institutions in Ireland were monasteries, because these were great rural centers, and so the monks ruled over the bishops generally. Irish monasticism was very austere. The Irish monks were more ascetic than the monks we'll be meeting next week from the Benedictine tradition started in Italy. And they also were less fixed in one place. In Benedictine monasticism, you're not supposed to move. You're supposed to be stable. You're supposed to go through the same routine every day. The Irish favored a more wandering existence and the establishment of little communities or colonies far away, The Irish form of piety emphasizes exile. And it might be exile to a scary and almost unimaginable kind of environment. There are, for example, lots of little islands in the Irish Sea that seem to be uninhabitable. That is, if you look at them from the tour boat, you see a lot of birds, and it's birders' paradise, but in the middle of July it's overcast, raining, and the sea is pounding. And then you notice there are little remnants of houses. Yeah. Question? Little caves where people in the 6th and 7th century lived. Or the island is tiny, smaller than this building. And there, it looks like 20 people were living there. What are they living on? Well, poultry, I guess. But this is a very severe form of asceticism. And the wandering also can mean just holing up on some island or wandering around the European continent and converting people. The Irish were great missionaries, both to England and to the continent, and we'll be talking about that some more. What about the Irish as the saviors of civilization? A book published about 8-9 years ago, How the Irish Saved Civilization, is like all such, well, most such popular books, kind of overdone and reductionist. It's not literally exactly true, but here again, as with England, we have a society that had no Roman influence and yet had a highly developed tradition of learning, preservation of Latin, in part very good knowledge of Latin because they didn't think they spoke it. Remember we said that people in the former Roman Empire, it's hard to date the point at which someone in Spain is no longer speaking Latin but is speaking something that we can start to call Spanish. In Ireland, the distinction was quite clear. You had to learn Latin in lessons. You had to go to class. You had to be taught Latin. And so the Latin that was taught was bookish, but for that, in many respects, correct. Finally, the Irish celebrated Easter according to a different calendar. And so we refer to the Irish or the Celtic church. We mean this more decentralized church, this somewhat more wandering missionary church, a church that was less hierarchical and less organized around bishops than that of its rival, Rome. The story of the 7th century in England is therefore partly the story of competition between paganism and Christianity and flip-flopping between them, and competition between Irish Christianity, represented by, for example, the monastery of Iona in what's now Scotland, Iona, the missions of St. Aidan, Aidan, whom Bede describes with great sympathy, even though he doesn't agree with him. But the controversy really centered, ultimately, or at least in an immediate sense, over Easter. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, it was decided to embrace the Roman calculation of Easter, and with that, bishops, hierarchy, a more organized church. I have a lot of trouble with this Easter problem. I mean, you will have noticed that I've evaded telling you exactly what the calculations are. Some of you may know much better than me. But the Jewish Passover is established by lunar months. Christians wanted to break with Jewish tradition in celebrating Easter according to a somewhat different calendar. So it combined lunar and solar methods of calculation, very complex operation, therefore. In the year 455, Rome, that is to say the papacy, under our friend Leo I, mission to the Huns, definition of the two natures of Christ, Leo I and Rome opted for a 19-year cycle of calculating Easter. But the Celtic churches cut off from the continent, remember, we're in this post-Roman world of very little contact, kept an 84-year cycle. So in the 7th century, when the Roman missionaries had arrived again, you have 2 conflicting dates for Easter every year. I mean, occasionally, just as with the Orthodox and Catholic Easters, they come together. So every so often they will actually be the same Sunday, but generally speaking different. And so you get these ludicrous scenes like King Oswy of Northumbria celebrating Easter according to the Celtic tradition, and his wife, who was from Kent, celebrated it according to the Roman tradition. So one Sunday was Celtic Easter, and then the next Sunday was Roman Easter. So it's not so much that Easter is so important intrinsically, but it is a symbol of the embrace of the Roman form of Christianity and the bringing of England into an orientation more towards the continent than towards the Celtic West. What is amazing, as I said before, is how quickly, once the conversion takes place, England becomes not only integrated into the continent, but a place of a great cultural accomplishment. The great Archbishop of Canterbury of this post-Whitby era, Theodore, Archbishop of Canterbury, 669 to 690, established bishoprics, monasteries, and endowed them with books. Theodore is an interesting character. He's actually from Syria. And how somebody from Syria becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, something that would be very unlikely now, in the 7th century AD, is an aspect of some preservation of the outlines of the cosmopolitan Roman world that we began the course with. There are a lot of Syrian popes at this time, too, Syrian and Greek popes from the Eastern Mediterranean. The first manuscript we have of the Bible as a single manuscript, in other words, where all of the books of the Bible are contained in the same volume, is from this place and this era, the so-called Codex Amiatinus. A magnificently decorated Bible sent to the Pope in 716, written at Bede's Monastery of Jarrow, now in Florence at the Medici Laurentian Library of Florence. It is decorated in this very distinctive style that you all know, if not from courses from Christmas cards and stuff. The Book of Kells is the most famous example of this. This is the so-called insular style because it's shared by both Celtic Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England. Lots of intricate curlicues, complicated animals, magnificent contrasts of color, a kind of abstraction when you first look at it. It looks like an oriental carpet. But in fact, if you look at it a little more closely, you can see that there are all sorts of little intertwined animals or fantastic shapes and colors within it. Questions? Problems? We could spend an entire semester on England, but I think we've had at least a taste of its significance, both in its own right and as one more and rather different aspect of the post-Roman world that we've been occupied with. I'll see you for the exam on Monday.